Hello everyone. Today we'll be beginning our unit on narrative structure and the elements of fiction. This digital story will give you an overview of everything that we will be covering within this unit. It may seem overwhelming at first, but we'll take each element on its own and we'll have plenty of examples from Alice in Wonderland. Now let's get started. First of all, you're probably wondering what narrative structure is and what the elements of fiction are. The elements of fiction are the pieces that are put together to build the content of a story. They're like building blocks in a way. Every story needs certain elements to make sense and to be considered a real story. Literary elements give readers the who, what, when, where, why, and how of a story. Narrative structure is the way all the pieces of a fiction story are organized. Many fiction stories have a similar structure, so we often use the general fiction structure to talk about stories. Have you ever noticed that the stories you read seem to begin, grow, and end in a similar way? This is the narrative structure at work. Keep in mind, narrative structure is more than just beginning, middle, and end. Now that you're familiar with the basics, let's start at the beginning. Narrative structure has 5 parts. It begins with exposition or introduction. The introduction is followed by the rising action, climax, falling action, and conclusion or resolution. In the introduction, literary elements such as character, setting, and point of view are introduced. This means that the introduction tells readers who the story is about, when and where it takes place, and who is telling the story. Once the story has been introduced, the rising action begins. In the rising action, the reader gets more information about characters and setting. The reader might also discover which characters are protagonists, or leading characters, and which characters are antagonists, or the enemy or rival of the protagonist. In Alice in Wonderland, Alice is our protagonist. She is the leading character of the story. As she goes down the rabbit hole, she begins her journey into Wonderland. This becomes our setting. As she falls down the rabbit hole, she's unsure of her situation, which becomes a problem for her. She meets several characters along her way, including the Cheshire Cat, who somewhat helps her, but somewhat confuses her also. She also meets the Queen of Hearts, who acts as an antagonist and is very angry, often yelling, "Off with his head," when things don't go her way. The Queen of Hearts poses a conflict for Alice. A conflict is when a character or several characters face a problem. Conflicts can come from outside of a character, like from another character or situation, or from inside a character, like from their own thoughts or feelings. During the rising action, many events occur and build off one another. Next, the climax of the story happens. Climax means peak or turning point. During the climax, the conflict might reach its most intense or dramatic point. For example, Alice faces the Queen of Hearts and her jury in court during the climax of the story. At this point, Alice is so frustrated and tired of being constantly confused by Wonderland and its characters that she finally stands up for herself and takes control of the situation. After the climax, the falling action begins. At this point in the story, the conflict begins to be solved. This can be seen when Alice finally escapes Wonderland. Finally, during the resolution, the conflict is solved and the reader learns the outcome of the story. During the resolution, the reader realizes that Alice had fallen asleep and dreamed the whole story. She wakes up from her dream and finds that she never really was trapped in Wonderland at all. By this point, readers can identify a theme. Theme is the central idea or message that can be taken from a story. One important theme in this story is the journey into adulthood. By the end of a fiction story, we have moved through the narrative structure from introduction to rising action, to climax, to falling action, and finally to resolution. We have also discovered elements including characters, point of view, setting, conflict, and theme of the story. Now we can get to work reading a story and learning to identify its elements and breaking down its narrative structure.